Now on to Jeffrey Herf. He's a senior fellow of the Center, professor of history at the University of Maryland at College Park. His specialty is 20th century European intellectual history and especially German history. His study of authoritarianism becomes more relevant by the day. He's won more awards and published more papers than I could possibly list here, and has lectured widely in the United States, Europe, and Israel. He's produced fascinating research about Nazism, the Cold War, and the politics of Holocaust memory in East and West Germany. In Undeclared Wars with Israel, a particular favorite of mine, he told the fascinating and disturbing story of German anti-Semitism, especially that of the DDR, which backed terrorism against Israel. With Matthias Kunzel in Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, he told the story of Nazism's efforts to spread anti-Semitism and totalitarianism into the Middle East. Today's talk, Israel's Moment, about his very exciting new book, will address the anti-Zionist tropes that abound over the creation of Israel. For instance, that it was set up by imperialism and that it was set up out of sympathy for the Holocaust.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Thank you very much, David Hirsch and David Seymour and all of the other people who've worked so hard to launch the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. I'm honored and pleased to be able to talk about Israel's Moment. The book is not primarily a history of anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism has always involved telling lies about Jews. And some of the lies or falsehoods or myths, whichever term you prefer, about the establishment of the State of Israel was that it had something to do with British and American imperialism, that it was part of the history of colonialism, that it was a form of racism, and that the global left was always opposed to this horrific thing, this terrible State of Israel. But Israel's Moment is a history of what actually was taking place. And at the center of that history is the British government and the United States government and their policies. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit more about Britain than I have when I've in some of the presentations I've made about the book. But let's get down to brass tacks. For those somewhat familiar with the international political debate about the establishment of the State of Israel, the phrase Israel's Moment evokes a short period, a fleeting period, a window of opportunity from May of 1947 to May of 1949, when both the Soviet Union, Stalin's Soviet Union, and the President of the United States, Harry Truman, supported the establishment of a Jewish state in British Mandate, in former British Mandate Palestine. My Israel's Moment confirms this famous, familiar, and short-lived agreement. Yet my examination of the records of the United Nations, fascinating records, the files of the United States State Department and the Department of Defense, of France's Foreign Ministry, France's Ministry of the Interior, the political debate in the halls of Congress in Washington, the liberal and left-leaning press, especially in New York, stresses either forgotten or far too little acknowledged realities of Israel's moment. And here are the three core findings of this 500-page book. First, while President Truman's support for the Zionist project was crucial, the support of the Soviet Union, Stalin's Soviet Union, and the Soviet bloc was even more consequential. And that support was evident in the diplomatic battles waged in the General Assembly and the Security Council at the United Nations. It was evident when the recently Stalinized state of Czechoslovakia, with Soviet agreement, sent arms to the Jews when they needed them most in the 1948 war, and when the Soviet bloc facilitated Jewish immigration to pre-state Palestine and to Israel when the British Navy was doing everything it could to prevent it. The window of opportunity for the establishment of the Jewish state was brief, and it was made possible first by the Jews in Palestine themselves, but also by the fresh memories of the Holocaust and the anti-Nazi passions of its immediate aftermath. Israel's Moment took place at a major turning point in global politics, as the alliances of the Second World War were giving way to different and even reversed coalitions of the early Cold War. The Zionist project emerged between the binaries of anti-communism and communism. It did not fit. West and East did not fit. And this was a fact that confounded decision makers in Moscow, Paris, London, and Washington. But it was well understood by the two leading figures of the Zionist project, future Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and future Foreign Minister Moshe Sharett. And one of the convictions I have in having worked on this book that Ben-Gurion and Sharett are two of the great political figures of world history in the 20th century. Second, perhaps due to the understandable attention devoted to Truman's support for the UN partition resolution of November 29, 1947, that supported the establishment of an Arab state and a Jewish state in Palestine, and then to his recognition, his decision to recognize the state of Israel on the day it was founded in May of 48, historians have not paid sufficient attention to other aspects of the United States government, namely the emphatic, persistent, and consequential opposition to the Zionist project from the United States State Department, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as their very close collaboration with the British Foreign Office, the British military, and British intelligence services, under the leadership especially of Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin. Israel's moment presents more evidence than has appeared in scholarship up to now about an anti-Zionist consensus that emerged at the top of the United States national security establishment, led by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, former five-star General George C. Marshall, and articulated by the first director of the State Department's new policy planning staff, George F. Kennan. To an extent that has not been examined before, this was an Anglo-American consensus. It was an Anglo-American consensus. The American and British diplomats and military leaders viewed the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine as a threat to American and Western access to Arab oil, as a boon to the prospects for Soviet and communist expansion in the Middle East, and as a threat to American national security interests in the early months of the policy of containment of the Soviet Union and communism. The British Foreign Office, under Bevin's leadership, was the vanguard of the opposition to the Zionist project, a fact that has been lost in the fog of Cold War propaganda and the leftist anti-Zionism of recent decades. Indeed, it is a most interesting aspect of British history that it produced two national leaders, Ernst Bevin and recently, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, who for completely opposed reasons rejected the Zionist project. Third, though support for the establishment of the Jewish state in the United States encompassed both the Democratic and Republican parties, the loudest and most persistent voices in the political realm outside the formal organizations of the Jewish community came from some of the most prominent liberal politicians in American politics and from prominent liberal, and leftist intellectuals and journalists. These figures included well-known figures in the United States, such as Senator Robert Wagner, a lion of the New Deal, Congressman Emanuel Seller, known for his opposition to racist immigration legislation in the United States, former Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Welles, and journalists, left-wing journalists, left-liberal journalists such as Frida Kirchway, I.F. Stone, writers for The Nation, and left-leaning dailies such as PM and the New York Post. These were the counterpart to the Manchester Guardian in Britain and to Richard Crossman in the House of Commons, who emerged as Bevin's chief and most important and most articulate critic. After the Soviet Union launched its anti-Semitic and anti-cosmopolitan purges beginning in the late 49, it concluded that Israel was not, as Stalin had hoped, not going to be an appendage of Soviet influence in the region. The Soviet Union, as you all know, then embarked on an unfortunately successful 40-year propaganda campaign to reverse the realities of Israel's moment and, quote, blame the United States for Israel's emergence. It was silent about the evidence of Soviet and communist support for the Jews in Israel, and it spread the consequential falsehood that Israel was a product of U.S. imperialism. In the United States, the importance of Soviet-era support for the Zionists and the realities of opposition in the power ministries of the United States government was lost in an exaggeration of the importance of Truman's decision-making and a minimization of the impact of opposition from the national security establishment. The book in no way underemphasizes or minimizes the role of Harry Truman. He was an exceptionally courageous figure. He was the only leading anti-communist of his own administration who was also a Zionist. That combination of liberal anti-communism and support for the state of Israel was not typical, either in the power ministries of the United States government or in London. In 1984, the major historian of British imperialism, William Roger Lewis, published The British Empire in the Middle East, 1945 to 51. Those of you who have not read Lewis's 1984 book, I would strongly recommend it. Those of you who know his work, he is a marvelous historian. And he examines there the Attlee-Bevan government's reversal of the Labour Party's previous pro-Zionist position. As the British withdrew from India, Attlee and Bevan became more determined to preserve influence in the Middle East. At the Labour Party's conference in Bournemouth in early June 46, Bevan gave his critics, such as Crossman and a host of American liberals, reason to wonder if anti-Semitism was an influence on his policy. He famously said, in response to Harry Truman's urging that the British Navy lift its blockade and allow 100,000 Jewish survivors of the Holocaust to enter Palestine, Bevan said, "I hope I will not be misunderstood in America if I say that this 100,000 was proposed with the purest of motives. They, the Americans, did not want too many Jews in New York." So Ernst Bevan became a much despised figure in New York City in 1945, 46, 47. In his Palestine mission, an account of his work on the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, Crossman spoke of a concealed anti-Semitism that he thought was influencing British policy toward the Jews in Palestine. And in December of 1945, I.F. Stone, writing in the left liberal paper PM, attributed Attlee and Bevan's adoption of the anti-Zionist views of the British Foreign Office to having served in the British cabinet during World War II, and thus began to adopt, quote, I'm quoting Stone, views molded by snobbery, imitation, and conformity to the upper class, largely Tory and imperial point of view. Stone attributed the generally pro-Arab sentiments among most British officials in Palestine to their, quote, autocratic colonial mentality. They thought it easier to deal with Arabs than Jews because they viewed the former, the Arabs, as natives, the latter as European equals who did not accept assumptions of colonial superiority. Note how differently Richard Crossman thinks about questions of Orientalism, colonialism, and anti-colonialism that became fashionable since Edward Said published his famous book. My work in the archives of the State Department, which include a lot of British files as well, confirms I.F. Stone's very perceptive remarks about the purposes of British policy. This is what Stone wrote in 1945. The British are using anti-Zionism in the Middle East to unite the Arab world under British leadership and to divert Arab nationalist agitation from an anti-British to an anti-Jewish basis. If this policy requires the abandonment of the Balfour Declaration, the stoppage of Jewish immigration to Palestine, the relegation of the Yishuv to the precarious status of another ghetto in the Arab world, these British officials are fully prepared to pay the price. It's no skin off their elbows. This, Stone wrote, is the essence of British policy in the Middle East. So in Stone's view, anti-Zionism, that is opposition to the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine, and support for Arab rejection of the promises of the Balfour Declaration, were central to Britain's efforts to sustain, not undermine its imperial presence in the Middle East. I had a great deal of, I found it very interesting to work in the files of the French Foreign Ministry. As many of you know, in May of 1945, the French army arrested Haj Amin al-Husseini. And from then until June of 1946, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was then very famous for his collaboration with the Nazi regime, was under house arrest outside of Paris and under the control of the French Foreign Ministry. I don't have time to go into the details of that house arrest, except to say that during that time, French diplomats, overseen by Georges Bidault, the leading figure was Henri Ponceau, a former ambassador, French ambassador to Lebanon, had many conversations with Husseini, and it became apparent to them that Husseini was indeed an anti-Semite, and that he had no intention of abandoning his previous views regarding the Nazis, though he spun some apologia about what he did and didn't do during the Holocaust. And the French Foreign Ministry concluded that it would not extradite Husseini to Britain. It would not extradite Husseini to the Allies in Nuremberg. It would not extradite Husseini to Yugoslavia, where he might have been placed on trial. And the absence of a trial of Husseini was, I think, one of the very important events that did not take place in 1945-46, because had a trial taken place, it now is apparent that both the United States and British governments had enormous amounts of material that were sufficient to indict him and to ruin his political reputation around the world. And that might have made it more difficult for the Mufti to return to political prominence as he did. The absence of an indictment and trial of Haj Amin al-Husseini in 1945-6 was, and now I'm speaking as a historian of post-war Germany and post-war Europe, both the author of Divided Memory, friend of Tony Judd's, thinking of Tony Judd's post-war. This was one of those examples of short-term amnesia that accompanied the shift to the Cold War, in which many quote ex-Nazis and Nazi collaborators were able to avoid a reckoning in the late 40s and early 50s. And the Husseini case is not only a Middle East story, it's also a story that historians of West Germany and France, in other words, have written many fine articles and books about that non-reckoning in the early years of the Cold War. But I also want to draw attention to Haj Amin al-Husseini's cousin, Jamal. Jamal Husseini was free to engage in politics, and he did so as leader of the Arab Higher Committee and as the representative of the Arab Higher Committee eventually at the United Nations. But before he came to the United Nations, he attended a conference in London in January 27th of 1947, to be exact. And a diplomat from the United States Embassy in London was there. Lewis Jones, wrote a memo, took good notes, and Husseini gave a speech, which he gave again in September of 47 when he was leading the Arab Higher Committee at the United Nations. And the essence of it is, here I'm trying to shorten because the documents, of course, take time to read. The essence of his is contained in these sentences. He said, "The Arab world is a territorial continuity inhabited by a homogeneous population with one national outlook. As such, it is free from serious frictions and a natural bulwark for peace. Homogeneity in race, Jamal Husseini said, has always been the natural basis for mutual understanding and community of interest. The creation of an alien Jewish state in Palestine means the destruction of this territorial continuity and national homogeneity, and the creation of a running sore that will undoubtedly become a permanent source of trouble in the Middle East." And that text was on the desks of Secretary of State Marshall, Deputy Secretary of State Robert Lovett, the officials in the Department of the Office of Near Eastern Affairs, and the policy planning staff. In other words, they had very, very clear evidence of his views about the desirability of homogeneity in race. One of the great successes of the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Soviet bloc and others who assisted in its diplomatic and propaganda efforts, especially from the 1960s onwards, was to obscure, repress the history of the racism of the Arab Higher Committee and the racism, not just anti-Semitism, but that too, but the racism that was one factor leading to the rejection of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. So when we on campus hear about the values of diversity, of plurality, of difference, of otherness, ordinarily those arguments are waged against Israel. And it's forgotten that the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee thought that the introduction of this alien, different other in an otherwise homogeneous region would be a terrible, terrible thing. The Andrei Gromyko's speech at the United Nations in May of 1947 is probably something that is familiar to many of you. I go over it. Gromyko, when he spoke in May of 47 in favor of the two-state solution, sounded like the former Soviet ambassador to Britain, Ivan Maisky. Gabriel Gorodetsky has done such a splendid job of editing the fantastic Maisky diaries. Or Maxim Litvinov. That distinct tradition of Soviet foreign policy that rejected anti-Semitism, and that it was a genuine kind of anti-fascism. At least Gromyko spoke that way. The man was a remarkable survivor. It's amazing he stayed out of prison after giving these speeches, but he did. And Gromyko is understandably famous, but there's a few other Soviet diplomats that I want to bring attention to. One of them is Alfred Fedorkiewicz, who was the Polish representative to the United Nations and became vice president of the General Assembly. And on May 12th, he spoke to the committee in the UN that was dealing with the Palestine question, and I don't have time to read this really remarkable speech that Alfred Fedorkiewicz gave. Alfred Fedorkiewicz, after the war, became the mayor of Krakow and was the director of a commission on the memorial of the Holocaust in post-war Poland. But he spoke of the bond created between a very close bond formed between Jews and Poles. I know that there's a lot of romanticism about that, and Jan Gross, obviously, and Jan Grabowski have much to say about it. But nevertheless, there's something there. And he said he knew a lot about the Holocaust. He said he knew a lot about the Holocaust and about the extermination of the Jews in Europe. And why did he know a lot? He knew that the Jews from all of Europe were brought into the extermination camps erected by the Nazis on Polish soil, and they perished there in the gas chambers. And then he said, I was there myself, and I saw 1.5 to 2 million burned in crematoria. So there you have it, an Auschwitz survivor on the floor of the United Nations, then making the case for the establishment of the Jewish state. UN records do not contain a comparable statement either about the Holocaust or the Nazi background of the members of the Arab Higher Committee by Ambassador Warren Austin of the United States or any other member of the United States delegation, including Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a staunch Zionist. Israel's moment traces the diplomatic battles at the United Nations that did not end in May of 47, but the record shows that over the course of the summer of 47 and then into the fall of 48 and spring and summer, the fall of 47, the spring and summer of 48, that Gromyko, along with Fedorkiewicz and along with someone named Vasyl Tarasenko, the representative of the Ukrainian SSR, more about Tarasenko in a few moments, they fought a continuous battle at the United Nations against the United States and Britain, and in accord with, in alignment with Moshe Shertok, later Moshe Sherratt, and Ab Iban. It is the more that the Israelis and the Soviet bloc were singing the same tune at the United Nations, the more the British Foreign Office, the more the State Department and the Pentagon was concluding that, yes, there's something about this connection between the communists and the Jews, the Soviets and the Zionists, that is very troubling. For purposes of our talk today, I'm going to skip over one of my favorite parts of the book, and that is the close connection between French socialists, ministers of the Interior, Edward Depreux, Jules Moch, Adrien Tixier, beginning in with Tixier beginning in 1944, really, that is a story of mutual collaboration, between the Mossad and the French Ministry of the Interior. And the French Ministry of the Interior infuriated the French Foreign Ministry, and it infuriated the British Foreign Office, because, of course, the French Ministry of the Interior denied publicly that it was supporting the Mossad, but in fact, what was going on was that they were issuing all kinds of passports of dubious validity in order to facilitate the very Jewish emigration that the British were doing their best to oppose. So there's momentum. If I can summarize what I've said so far, from 45 to the fall of 47, the momentum in public opinion in the United States, on the continent, among liberal opinion in Britain, in favor of the Zionist project was growing. And at the same time that that momentum grew, the concern within the British Foreign Office and the State Department also expanded. Here, timing is something to keep in mind. In March of 47, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. The United States was going to oppose, by force if necessary, the expansion of communism. In June of 47, Secretary of State Marshall announced the Marshall Plan at graduating ceremonies of Harvard University. And so this was literally, these were the months in which the United States turned from a kind of conceptual discussion of containment that Kennan had proposed in the famous long telegram of 1946, and it was becoming policy. This was policy. They were launching the Cold War. And at the same time that they were launching the Cold War, in the very same moment, very same months, these were the months in which the debate about the possible establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was taking place. And the files of the State Department include a great deal of material from the British Foreign Office and British intelligence agents who are sending reports about Soviet agents that are included in the refugee stream that are coming to Palestine in order to facilitate communist expansion. A word about Bevin and the Jewish question. In the summer of 47, he sent frequent messages to the French foreign minister, Georges Bidault, who was torn between the socialist ministers of the interior and the priorities of an alliance with Britain, that the French should stop the departures of ships from Marseille, which everybody knows was taking place. And why weren't the French preventing it? And Bevin wrote the following to Georges Bidault in the summer of 47. He had the most sincere sympathy for these unfortunate people who have been made the victims of those who seek to acquire a pecuniary profit out of the situation that has arisen. Jews in all parts of Europe are being encouraged to sell their possessions in order to purchase at extravagant rates a passage to Palestine. When it is too late, they discover that those who have taken their money have no means of affording them a safe passage, and they are obliged, having no resources left, to undertake the voyage, not only in conditions of extreme misery, but also faced by considerable dangers. Bevin was talking about the Mossad and about the effort to bring Holocaust survivors to Palestine. And that statement, in my view, is replete with anti-Semitic stereotypes. He depicted the Jewish agency and the Mossad as essentially criminal organizations, motivated first and foremost by the desire for financial gain. He depicted the Mossad's Bricha, the flight of survivors of the Holocaust to Palestine, as essentially a large-scale shakedown operation and, quote, infamous traffic that exploited the vulnerability of Jewish refugees for financial gain, and thus appeared to be another chapter in a supposed long history of Jewish money grubbing. Richard Crossman didn't have any doubts. He concluded, quote, "It was the stubborn refusal of the Yishuv to be grateful for Bevin's protection and to conform to the plans he made for them that finally tipped him into overt anti-Semitism, unquote. James G. MacDonald, a very important figure. His diaries are fascinating. The first U.S. ambassador to the State of Israel, reached a similar conclusion following a contentious conversation he had on August 3rd of 46 with Bevin to discuss the recommendations of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, of which he was a member. Following Bevin's angry rejection of Truman's request to allow 100,000 Jews into Palestine, MacDonald called it a diatribe. He wrote in his diary, "His bitterness against Mr. Truman is almost pathological. It found its match only in his blazing hatred for other scapegoats, the Jews, the Israelis, the Israeli government. Whatever Bevin personally thought about the Jews and Judaism, his frustration with the failures of British policy in Palestine led him to resort to arguments, this is my view, not MacDonald, that repeated anti-Semitic cliches and stereotypes." That brings us to the fall of 1947, September, October 47, a crucial period. What happened then in something called the Pentagon talks in Washington was a gathering of a very impressive group of high-ranking officials of the United States and British diplomatic corps and military leadership to discuss the implications of the just announced policy of containment and the Truman Doctrine for Western policy in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East. One of the memos in preparation for the talks expressed views that echoed throughout British and American policy in the subsequent months. Quote, "The essential fact is that because of clear Soviet aspirations in the Middle East, which if fulfilled would have a disastrous effect not only on American interests in the area, but on our general position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, it is essential that the Soviet expansion in that area be contained. Given our heavy commitments elsewhere and Britain's already established position in the area, it is our strong feeling that the British should continue to maintain primary responsibility for military security in the area." The logical implication of that argument was that, as George Marshall put it, the continued presence of Britain in the Middle East was, quote, the cornerstone of American thinking regarding the Middle East. And that is a central theme of Israel's moment. The person who more than anyone else brought these views from the periphery of the Arabists in the State Department or the Arabists in the French Foreign Office, who brought those views from the perhaps dismissible provincial views of diplomats who had spent too much time in the Arab capitals. The person who brought those views into the center of American thinking and a consensus in the State Department was the most brilliant diplomat in the early years of the Cold War, one of the finest writers in international relations in the last half century, and that, of course, is George F. Kennan. And in January and February of 1948, Kennan wrote memos as the director of the policy planning staff of the State Department. And because I've spoken for almost 30 minutes, I'm not going to quote them directly. You can see them in the book. But he offers a brilliant and eloquent argument as to why the establishment of the State of Israel would be an absolute disaster for American national security interests. And the disaster would be because such a Jewish state would enrage the Arabs, make it difficult for the United States to get access to Arab oil, just when the United States was focused on the economic recovery of Eastern Europe, of Western Europe, excuse me, and that, yes, the Jewish state would be a kind of Trojan horse or a possible funnel for Soviet influence into the Middle East, just at the time when the United States was trying to bring about precisely the reverse. The Kennan memos are really fascinating and important, and they are important not only because Kennan wrote them, but because Kennan was appointed by George Marshall and was very close to Marshall. So this became part of what I referred to earlier as the Anglo-American anti-Zionist consensus in the power ministries of the United States and Britain, the military and diplomatic power ministries. There are many in a long book. Those of you who are historians know the difficulty we have in talking about long books because we become so fascinated with various documents and we want to tell everybody about them. And I won't do that now. But there's one document that I just want to draw your attention to, and it's called a document of February 1948 from the British Joint Intelligence Committee that was sent to the Secretary of the U.S. Joint Intelligence Committee and thus given to the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's called Short-Term Intentions of the Soviet Union in Palestine, circulating at the top levels of the British and American military. And it concluded that Russian policy in Palestine was aimed at preventing the creation of a Middle East anti-Soviet bloc. After the establishment of a Jewish state, the Soviet Union would probably try to increase influence in it by penetration of Jewish civil and military administration with a view to future exploitation, immigration, illegal if necessary, of agents, propagandists, and guerrilla leaders. And when it came to the Arabs, the Soviet Union would probably exploit their nationalism, but both British and American intelligence through this period were convinced that the Arabs, given their religiosity, were far more conservative than the Jews and would be a more difficult nut to crack for the Soviet Union as it tried to expand. A word about Vasyl Tarasenko, with Russia's fascist war of extermination in mind. In the spring of 1948, Count Foka Bernadotte, tragically later, unfortunately, assassinated by Leahy, the right-wing Zionist terrorist group, was appointed as UN mediator. And he advocated something called the Bernadotte Plan, which is long and complicated, but the bottom line is that it would have amputated the Negev desert, taken away the Negev desert from the new state of Israel, which had been promised in the partition plan of 1947. And in spring and summer of 1948, Vasyl Tarasenko, representing the Ukrainian SSR, was on a rotating seat in the Security Council, and he and Andrei Gromyko fought the good fight with Abba Eban and with Moshe Shertok against Warren Austin and Noel Baker, representing the United States and Britain. And here is Tarasenko on May 28th of 1948, opposing a British ceasefire proposal. He said it was designed to stifle the state of Israel. At the end of a 4-week period of the truce, the Jews would find their resources depleted while the Arabs would be prepared for a renewed onslaught. Again, the quote goes on much longer and it's very interesting, but you get the point that in 1948, when the issues were undecided, Vasyl Tarasenko, representing the Ukrainian SSR, was not one of those Nazi collaborating Ukrainians of which we all are so familiar. He was part of the traditions of Ukrainian anti-fascism. He became the chair of the history department at Vasyl Tarasenko University in Kiev, and in the 1950s and 60s. Tarasenko is a name that I hope people will keep in mind. In May of 1949, I'm coming to the end, James McDonald, the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, had a meeting with David Ben-Gurion and then Moshe Sharett. The State Department was quite irritated with David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett because they were reluctant to allow Arab refugees to return right away to the state of Israel, reluctant to change the borders, because they first insisted that the Arab states and the representatives of the Palestine Arabs sign a peace treaty, at least, which they were refusing to do. And the State Department wrote a memo, which the president signed, that threatened that the United States would have to, quote, reevaluate its relationship with the new state of Israel given all the marvelous things the United States had done for the state of Israel, Israel should be grateful and should listen to American wishes. David Ben-Gurion, those of you who know about Ben-Gurion, was not a man of many words. He's not famous for his eloquence, but he got to the point. The November 29 resolution, these in McDonald's notes, were never carried out by the United Nations, the United States. It contemplated two states, Israel and independent Arab Palestine, united by customs and by economic customs and other, and at peace with each other. He, Ben-Gurion, was unable to recall any strong action by the United States or the United Nations to enforce the partition resolution or to prevent aggression by Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq in 1948. Instead, the arms embargo enforced by the United Nations, initially proposed by the United States and Britain, encouraged aggressors against Israel, whose very existence was in danger. Ben-Gurion said to McDonald, had the Jews waited on the United States or the United Nations, they would have been exterminated. Ben-Gurion was blunt. Sherrod was eloquent. In the United Nations, when Israel was admitted to the UN, he gave a brilliant speech, which I cite in Israel's Moment, very diplomatically recalling the conflicts and debates and who supported and who opposed the Zionist project. He was everyone in the room understood exactly what he was saying when he referred to those episodes in which the United States abandoned the partition plan, imposed the arms embargo at a time when the Soviet Union was supporting the first and opposing the latter. So I'm concluding. I've spoken a little bit longer. This will take about 2 minutes. I leave it to my British colleagues to assess the continuities and breaks between the anti-Zionism of the British imperial establishment of 1945-48 and the anti-Zionism of the anti-imperialist left of the Corbyn era. From opposite ends of the political spectrum, they arrived at the same rejection of the Zionist project. And both, in different ways, convinced their critics that they expressed anti-Semitic, not only anti-Zionist beliefs. This raises the issue of what connects the disparate political passions of Ernst Bevin and Jeremy Corbyn. Both, after all, insisted they were not anti-Semites, but both, I think, protested rather too much on that score. Britain was at war with the Zionists, and British soldiers died, not only at the King David Hotel. And such deaths, such events sink deep into Britain's memory. And as an outsider, it seems to me that those events must have had some influence on views of Zionism and Israel in the United Kingdom. The difference, one that Jeremy Corbyn and his followers either never knew or have forgotten, is that Bevin and the British Foreign Office believed that the imperatives of British imperial presence in the Middle East, access to Arab oil, preventing communist expansion, containing communism around the world, all appeared to work against and not in favor of establishing the Jewish state in Palestine. The Zionist project was a form of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, waged in part against the British presence in Palestine. The poles of imperialism and imperialism, with Jamal al-Husseini in mind, of racism and anti-racism. These poles were precisely the reverse of those depicted in Britain and elsewhere by Israel's anti-imperialist critics of recent decades. The realities of British, but especially American official opposition as well, the Soviet leftist and liberal support for the establishment of the Jewish state faded from world politics in the Cold War. Following the Soviet turn against Israel during the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, the Soviet bloc, the Palestinian organizations, the Arab states, and then the global left told a very different version. And that was a story that replaced the actual realities of 45 to 49 with influential fictions of Zionism as a form of racism and as a tool of American imperialism, and an embarrassed silence about the consequential support for the Jews from the communists in 1947 to 49. The forgetting of the Nazi collaboration of the leaders of the Arab Higher Committee and the guilty association of Zionism with communism were important aspects of the early years of the Western Cold War. Israel's moment was that brief period in Washington and London and Paris when the passions of anti-fascism had not yet been completely displaced or modified by those of global containment and anti-communism. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. I'm sure there will be many people wanting to speak. I do have one question that was put to me directly in the chat that maybe you could answer if you don't mind now, or maybe take a few minutes to drink your water.
It takes 2 seconds to drink a glass of water. It's done. So
okay. All right. This came from Jonathan Meldrum.
yes.
He asked if I could ask you, pull it up. How much of a driving force in contemporary anti-Zionism do you think was al-Husseini's argument for the desirability of undiluted racial hegemony in the Middle East?
Well, I think that the arguments made by Hamas that Palestine is Islamic territory amount to pretty much the same thing as what Jamal Husseini was saying. Jamal Husseini was a far more secular figure than the leaders of Hamas. So he spoke photos. He's a modern man, so he wouldn't quote the Quran. But I think the rejection of otherness is that Islamist dimension is there in the background, and I think the questioner I'm not giving an adequate answer because I think that the issue has not been explored enough. And one reason that the issue has not been explored sufficiently is that it is utterly heretical in our intellectual world to even suggest that there could possibly be the slightest shred of racism in the Palestine leadership. That is like a logical flaw, a category error. So there's research to be done. Not only, yes, about anti-Semitism, but also about this notion that peace is the product of homogeneity. Wars in Europe are the product of diversity, and that indeed may be an idea that's spreading around the world in 2022, rather more than we would like it to be. I don't think that's an adequate answer. I think it's an excellent question, and it's something that people should. It's one of those questions that young scholars and not so young scholars would be very reluctant to pose in many seminars on Middle East history, but it needs to be posed.
Great, thank you. Now I need, all right, there we go. Alan Luxembourg, and yes, I guess go ahead and speak. And then we've got Ephraim Nissan.
Thanks, that was a fascinating talk. I'm wondering, as far as I can tell, the opposition of the American national security establishment to Israel was, according to what you've so far said, was purely strategic in nature. It was not an element of anti-Semitism as is widely supposed. So I just want to make sure I'm interpreting your remarks correctly and that that is the case.
These are gentlemen and very intelligent people, highly educated. There's a certain lack of passion, shall we say, about the Holocaust in their memos, a certain distance from it all, a certain irritation with the Jews in the United States who are causing them so much trouble. And I think it's a kind of United States in 1940, 45, 46, 47 was a society which had only begun really, in the earliest stages of dealing with white racism, and the South was completely segregated, Jim Crow was intact, and anti-Semitism in American public life, according to public opinion polls, peaked in June of 1944 when American forces hit the beaches. So this was anti-Semitism was a potent force in American life, and there's no reason to think that it wasn't part of the East Coast Ivy League establishment that was dominant in the State Department. The American military was a very Southern institution. And there you find some of the ideas about Jews, as Joseph Bendersky has put, as indicated in his fine work, a little more raw, a little more explicit. But the I have not written a book in which I said the reason they did this was because they were anti-Semites. I think that I would rather let readers judge that for themselves. I think that the absence of empathy is really apparent in the officials, American officials and British officials working in Europe who were dealing with refugees. Of course, there were American and British officials who had a lot of empathy, but some others just were clueless about what had happened in Eastern Europe and the Holocaust. And very quickly after the war, they began to see things in terms of communism and anti-communism and forgot what had just so recently happened. So I think what was primarily on their mind, and they also did not understand the relationship between anti-communism and anti-Semitism. And there's obviously an anti-communism that had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but this association of Jews and communism, which had been in the air for decades, reemerges after the war in the way that some of the officials talk about the Soviet Union and Zionism.
Thank you. All right, Ephraim Neeson? You need to unmute. Okay.
Thank you for this talk. I just wanted to say about Haj Amin al-Husseini. The 1929 financial crash much strengthened him because the British administration was not contributing significantly to healthcare and education in Palestine. So it was up to the voluntary sector. And for that reason, there were a lot of young teachers in the Arab sectors who didn't have a job because of the crisis. And he had an agreement with the government of Iraq to send them to teach in Iraq. They were not fully integrated, and that was quite fine for him because he wanted them to depend on him. And they preached against the Jews and against the Kurds. Because the Kurds, because they were not Arab, and the Jews, because they were not Muslim. And actually, he made much while in Europe of the Herzegovina, Bosnian Herzegovina background of this family. And this is quite important when we talk about indigeneity in the Middle East of Jews, because of course, now more than half of the Jews of Israel are of Middle Eastern origin. But the Palestinians themselves often take pride in the Bosnian origin of a lot of families. And also, Haj Amin al-Husseini would not let anybody capture the limelight. At Radio Berlin, there was one Iraqi broadcaster who was a kind of playboy and kind of Omar Sharif. And he, for example, would warn the Jews of London, Finchley will come and take everybody. My uncle told me because he heard that.
Yeah, so if I could interrupt, I mean, the Husseini story is famous, and
Yes.
in Britain, David Mottadl's Islam and Nazi Germany's Islam and Nazi Germany's War. In Germany, Martin Cooper's and Klaus Michael Mallmann. In Israel's V. El Peleg. I mean, there's a large literature on Husseini, and I've written about Husseini and Nazi propaganda for the Arab world. So I don't want to get into the long, famous biography of Haj Amin al-Husseini. My point and what is new and I think important about Israel's moment is the question of the trial and the absence of a trial in 1945-46. The things that you mentioned about Husseini are famous and well known, and it's good to hear them again. But the French had him in custody, and
Yes.
the events might have turned out quite differently if decision makers in Washington and London and Paris had taken a different attitude. And Tony Judt and István Deák and Jan Gross and others have written well about the absence of trials of collaborators, not only the Arab collaborators but French and others. So that's what I'd like to say about Husseini, and I don't really want to talk more about his biography because that's it's not old news, but it's very famous news.
Perhaps the French wanted to spot the British as rivals. They supported Israel for that very reason. When Britain supported Lebanon's independence, when
Could be.
wanted,
I mean, the British foreign. Excuse me, but there are some other people who want to pose questions.
yes,
So, yes, the French saw leniency towards Husseini as part of an effort to restore or preserve French imperial presence in the Middle East. And again, that is counter to the myth that surrounds Husseini of a great struggler against imperialism and colonialism. On the contrary, he sought to work closely with France, as he thought France was the one imperial power that would be sympathetic to him.
thank you very much.
Thanks for your question.
Okay, next I have Joanna Michlik, who I understand is going to be speaking next week about the Holocaust memory in Poland, and I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, Kathleen. And Jeffrey, thank you for this fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you about your take on the book by Paul Hanebrake that we all know. I mean, you also wrote a review about the myth of Judeo-communism in the light of your research, because as you know, Paul Hanebrake argues that after the Second World War, suddenly there was the whole, in the United States and also in the liberal Western Europe, there was that abandonment of the concept of Judeo-communism. And the concept of Judeo-communism and the fight against communism was replaced by the concept of our common Judeo-Christian civilization. Mm-hmm. And yet, I think this process and what you show, that I think it's much more complicated, and when it comes to Israel moment, it was much more complex. That actually this process did not take place as easily and as smoothly as Paul Hanebrake will argue.
Joanna, it's very good to see you. Thank you for your question. Paul's book is a very good one when he's talking about Central Europe and his discussion of Hungary. It's not unusual that people are best and when they write most about what they know most about. So the book is very worth reading in that regard. The guilty association of Jews with communism was a factor in American politics. It's evident in McCarthyism. It came to the fore during the Rosenberg trial. David Nassau, book The Last Million, very fine book, has discussed the relationship between the new Cold War, anti-Semitism and anti-communism there. Again, as those of you who know my works, I've been a severe critic of communism for decades and decades. So I'm not saying that anti-communism is not synonymous with anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that. What Paul doesn't discuss in that book, and I think that that's one of the original contributions of Israel's moment. Perhaps others have focused about it, but I don't think quite as much. And that is the extent to which Zionism, both in the power ministries in London and Washington, and I didn't examine public opinion as much, the extent to which Zionism was associated with the Soviet Union and with communism. That Zionism was a pretty out there thing to support in 1940s and 1950s. It wasn't just because the original Zionist generation were secular Jews of a socialist bent, but though that was true, but Zionism was a huge revolution in Western culture, and to support it took a certain. Obviously, there were the emotional dimensions, but also certain intellectual reflections about statelessness and sovereignty and all that. So I hope the book does contribute to more reflection on the issue that you raised. The Eisenhower administration was very Christological and not all that enthusiastic about Israel either. Dwight Eisenhower was certainly not an anti-Semite. Neither was John Foster Dulles, but Israel just didn't quite fit. This was not the interrogation of Christianity in the 1950s was not what we've seen in the subsequent decades. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
All right. Interesting. Thank you. Next, I have a good friend of the center, Anthony Julius. Welcome.
Thank you. So, Jeffrey, I just first of all, many congratulations on a really, outstanding book, as well as a very engaging presentation. And I'm really glad to be with you to celebrate the publication. So bravo and hats off. My question is about the connection between the period covered in your book and the current conjuncture, in the matter of anti-Zionism. Because insofar as you could say that anti-Zionism, the contemporary anti-Zionists have any kind of historical sense at all, broadly speaking, it's a highly Philistine and it operates, as we know, at a very low intellectual level of engagement with the histories
Right.
and arguments and all the rest of it, everything that's relevant is kind of disregarded. But insofar as it has any kind of historical purchase, even if we're seeking to understand it and that purchase is not alive to the anti-Zionists themselves, the origins seem to be in the 1960s rather than earlier. I'm talking about the anti-Zionists in the West, of course, not anti-Zionism in the Middle East itself. So if I were an anti-Zionist and I was asking myself the question, in that classic formulation, what is alive and what is dead?
Yeah.
In the anti-Zionism in your period of, under investigation.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you would agree with me that pretty much most of the anti-Zionist positions in across the formation of the state period are just not useful to contemporary anti-Zionism, and that therefore, my sense when I was reading your book was that it was a kind of across the river. Mm-hmm. You were describing a kind of set of ideological positions that we were in some essential sense disengaged from in our own current struggles. Anyway, that was just my sense, and I'm really keen to hear your.
Yeah, the research question would be, how hard did the British establishment fight back when the post-60s left attacked Israel? That's how I would put it. What did Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, the British intellectual, conservative, centrist, liberal establishment, how did it respond when this assault was taking place? And that's what I was getting at. That the King David Hotel, it sinks deep. There were British soldiers who were killed by Jews, and so I'm just putting that out as a hypothesis. You can see it sometimes in the editorials of The Economist, which it's lukewarm about Israel. They're not anti-Zionist, but it's lukewarm. So that would be the continuity. Yeah, I mean, the anti-Zionism of the last 50 years is an overwhelmingly leftist phenomenon, but I think some of them might be very, very surprised to read Israel's Moment and learn that they had a few things in common with Ernst Bevin, which would be rather embarrassing. Your question is a question that, that's why I kind of posed it at the beginning of my talk. How much of this is British and how much of it is leftist? How much of the trials of the diaspora resonate on left and right? Because we can quote Marx and we can quote Lenin, we can quote all the Trotskyists, and we know all that, look, BDS and the attack on Israel has been a pain in the United States. It's a big thing in this country, but the Democratic Party didn't get taken over by an anti-Zionist, and the Labor Party did. So there's a question there, not just about the left, but about Britain. And I don't have an answer to it, but I think Israel's Moment offers a few suggestions as to where people might ask fruitful questions. I hope.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Interesting exchange. Next, I have Liz Wagner.
Hi. Yes, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to tell you how wonderful and important I found this presentation to be. Really, I feel almost moved to tears because we hear so often by Palestinians and those supporting them, we are being silenced by the Jews. And to me, in truth, it's the Jews, it's Israel. We have been silenced. The history has been buried. And so a book like yours, really, I haven't read it yet, but I look forward to reading it. And I look forward to sharing with as many people as I can this presentation and recommending your book, because we need this kind of history to come out in order to fight the BDS and everything else that it is trying really to eliminate Israel, I feel.
Well, you're very kind, and thank you very, very much. I appreciate that a great deal. One of the other people who are listening or who are historians know that when you get engrossed in a subject, you feel like sometimes you get to know these people, and of course the sheer courage and heroism of people like Emanuel Seller and Robert Wagner and Richard Crossman and Ben-Gurion and Sherritt and and that generation did a remarkable thing.
Yes.
They were not saints. They made mistakes. They did some things they shouldn't have done. But on the whole, it was an enormous accomplishment, and against enormous odds. Enormous
Yes.
odds.
Yes.
So I'm not a romantic. I don't write history in order to tell great stories about fantastic heroes in the past. That's not the purpose of my history.
No.
But there is something to be said for appreciating the accomplishment of the Zionist project against very, very long odds, and appreciate the political significance of a statesman like David Ben-Gurion, because someone had to make the decision. We're going to do it now. We're going to do it now. We're not going to wait, because he knew that Stalin could turn on a dime at any moment. And when and if the Soviet Union changed its policy, the establishment of a Jewish state would be a pipe dream. Or now, if not a pipe dream, then the Jews would be fighting against the entire United Nations, and that would have been without arms. And that would have been very hard. So it's we are blessed to have far more resources at our disposal than the Zionist generation did, the founding Zionist generation, and so I'm glad to be able to use them. I really appreciate your comments very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, David Hirsch.
Jeff, thanks so much for your talk. Really, really interesting. Very simple question. Actually, to be fair, I think you have just answered it. It's about the title, really, Israel's Moment. And it seems to me there's an implication in there that at another moment, the story would have been very, very different. And yeah, I mean, you've just answered that really, but if you have another word to say on that, that would be really interesting.
Well, I think Stalin said, I'll get Gromyko to the United Nations to say nice things about the Jews, and we'll see. Maybe the Jews will turn out to be communists, maybe not. Maybe they'll be sympathetic to us, maybe they won't. So what's the problem? We'll try. If it doesn't work out, then we'll just tell the Arabs we made a mistake, and that it was all the fault of the Americans, and then we'll fight the Cold War. So not every foreign policy decision works out as you hope, and but it was yes. I mean, I don't want to be facetious. There was this very small period of very unusual agreement between the anti-communist president who launched the Cold War, Truman, and the dictator of the Soviet Union. It was a very short period of May 47 to May 49, and by fall of 49, it was over. This is somewhat related to your question. One of the most fascinating documents is a report by the Central Intelligence Agency. There's a wonderful thing, and we have such a wonderful government in the United States. It has something called CREST, CREST, and for our taxpayer dollars, they declassify millions of Central Intelligence Agency documents. And so one of these declassified documents is entitled Soviet Opposition to Arab Aspirations at the United Nations. And it's a very fine interpretation of all of Gromyko and Fedorkevich and Tarasenko and others' support for the Jews and their opposition to the Arabs. And it was published in done in 1953, and then given to the Arab governments. So you see, back there, when the Jewish state was founded, we didn't do it. It was the Soviets and the communists who did it. So it became a document in the American Cold War.
Sorry, I think there was a coincidence of interest between the USSR and the United States 2 or 3 years earlier at Nuremberg, which lasted less than a year, I think, until they fell out over Katyn.
Yeah. Well, yes, and that whole in another work I've called that period the Nuremberg Interregnum. The Cold War didn't begin right away after the Second World War, that's why those 4 years are so fascinating, because you see the intersection of the passions of the Second World War and those of the new Cold War, and Israel emerged right in the midst of all of that, and it didn't fit. It just didn't. It didn't fit clearly in the anti-communist consensus. It didn't fit in the communist world. It was in between, and because the Holocaust and the Jewish catastrophe and the Jewish question, they were not clearly and obviously understandable within the logic of communism and anti-communism, or even fascism and anti-fascism. But It was a brief period, and it required political leadership among the Zionists that made the decision that this was the moment that the state needed to be declared, even though it was likely that the Arab states were going to invade. It was either basically now or not for a very long time. And Ben-Gurion understood that. His correspondence, he corresponded with Churchill, and I don't know the full extent of the correspondence, but they admired one another greatly, and I can, when you think about the decisions they made, I can see why.
All right. Very, very interesting. And I need someone else to speak, which I think David is hopefully selecting someone. Otherwise, is there anyone else?
David had asked about arms embargoes. Did you want me to say a moment about the arms embargo?
Sure. In the meantime, in case anyone else wants to get on, please do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
actually,
please.
very clearly, because the anti-Zionist narrative says that Israel was set up by imperialism, and it was set up to do a job for imperialism. I mean, obviously, it doesn't fit at all. But not only was it not set up by imperialism, tell us about the arms embargo.
Well, the arms embargo began with Loy Henderson in the Division of African and Eastern Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department in November of 1947. An arms embargo on arms to all the states in the Middle East, the Arab states, as well as to Palestine. As Emanuel Seller, the spark plug in the Congress who supported the Zionist project, pointed out, the Arab states were states. They had harbors and airports and armies, and some had navies. They may not have been huge, but they were there. And the Jews were not yet a state. So if you impose an arms embargo on a bunch of states and a bunch of people who are not yet a state, it's going to have an unequal impact. Seller and Robert Wagner, Benzion Netanyahu, Joseph Schechtman, leaders of the American Zionist Emergency Council, pointed this out to the State Department, and the State Department knew very well that the impact was going to disadvantage the Jews more than the Arabs. At the United Nations, the State Department succeeded at the Security Council in passing resolutions that made what was originally a United States embargo into a United Nations embargo. So any state that was going to be sending arms to the Jews would be violating not just American or opposing American foreign policy, but now violating a UN embargo. And one of the things that I found so interesting about the early years of the United Nations is how effectively the United States learned how to use the United Nations to serve its foreign policy interests. Obviously, things changed later when the United States was losing votes regularly. But in the early years, it learned how to use the Security Council to advance its interests very effectively. And therefore, when Israel needed weapons, it could produce some of its own, but not enough. And it got them, as you all know, very famous, from Czechoslovakia. And the irony of the arms embargo, one irony, is that the Czech coup happened in March of '48. It's sometimes called the Czech coup. The communists took monopoly power. And then this newly Stalinized regime in Prague was the same regime that sent the weapons, jets, heavy artillery that the Jews needed very badly. And Ben-Gurion said it made a big difference. It made a very significant difference. The Czech arms. There's scholarship about this. I'm not the first person to point this out, but the Slansky trial of 1952-53 led to the executions of a number of Czech officials who were deeply involved in sending arms to Israel in 1948. So that was a very clear example of the way anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semitism of that trial, as you all know, was raw and clear and unambiguous. And one of the sins that they committed was the sin of Zionism and sending the weapons. So that the arms embargo of the United States, and that's why I quoted Ben-Gurion. If we had to depend upon you, we would have been exterminated. That's just you can't be more blunt. In the United States, there's a romanticism about Harry Truman, which has a kernel of truth, more than a kernel of truth. He was remarkably courageous. He was the only leading figure of his administration who was pro-Zionist. But he did not, he was up against George Marshall and James Forrestal. He was up against the CIA, up against everybody. And one thing that was a bridge too far for the president was to say, you're all wrong. Go jump in the lake. I'm sending the Jews weapons. Because at that point, he would have had to deal with resignations of all of his leading officials. That was just too much. So when the Jews needed the weapons the most, the Americans were saying no. And of course, the British, right? That goes without saying.
Okay, thank you. I understand there's a couple of more people. There's Walter and then Michael Goodman. Sorry, Walter, I don't know your last name and you're not, we don't have your video yet.
Really?
I see his video.
Okay, there we go. Hello, hello.
So, hi.
Walter, right, hello.
Just to follow up on a comment, Jeffrey, that you just made about Truman, this haberdasher, and he's sitting there by accident of history in the White House, and he's got George Marshall. I just finished watching Saving Private Ryan, that great movie.
Yeah, there's a scene with Marshall in it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was true to history. He very formidable figure, and a very formidable opponent of the creation of Israel. And you got this this guy, this haberdasher, whose friend is Eddie Jacobson, who's hardly an equal of Marshall. And yet Truman, despite all of this pressure against his decision, moves with his gut. How? You probably can't answer, and I don't know if anybody.
Well, actually, I can. Ron and Alice Radosh have written a superb book, A Haven for These People, Harry Truman and the founding of the State of Israel. And it's a reminder that politicians are human beings, and that Truman was a deeply religious, that he was immersed. He knew the Old Testament and the New Testament very well. He took his Christianity very seriously. And he was one of those Christians who thought that, who was philo-Semitic, not in the pejorative sense of that term, but in the sense that Christianity was indebted to Judaism, and that the relationship between the two was one of, what's the proper word? Not exactly love, but a fruitful relationship between the two religions. And
Filial.
So that was very, that was important for Truman. And and he had a good lawyer, very important. Clark Clifford was his assistant, and what Clark Clifford offered the president was a set of arguments as to why Marshall and Kennan were wrong. That, in other words, he wasn't going to change his mind just because of his heartstrings and because Eddie Jacobson, his pal from it was Kansas City, came to the White House and said, "Harry, please." That Clark Clifford said to Mr. President, the state of Israel is going to be a bastion for democracy in the Middle East. Mr. President, the Arabs have oil in the ground. It doesn't do them any good if it's in the ground. They've got to sell it to somebody. And they're going to sell it to people in Europe and the United States. So all these threats, they don't mean a thing. And also, Mr. President, the Jews are not a bunch of communists. That's just wrong. So you can make this decision, and it's perfectly compatible with the Truman Doctrine, with containment, and with fighting the Cold War. Those are Clifford's arguments, and those are exactly the arguments that Truman needed to hear. His pal Jacobson, that was important, and Truman's religiosity. But in Washington, when he had to make the arguments as president of the United States, whose primary responsibility is the national security interests of the United States, he had to have arguments basically saying Kennan is smart, Marshall is astute, but they're wrong. And that's what Clifford did for him. It's something that Mr. Jacobson couldn't do.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you. And I think the last speaker is going to be Michael Goodman. Or last question.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Are you there? Okay.
Yes, I am. I guess one question I had was, you mentioned 1948 as being a watershed when relations started to sour between the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, vis-a-vis Israel. Didn't they really, the point where things really became ugly, wasn't it at the time of the Six-Day War, when all the Eastern European countries broke with Israel, that the real anti-Zionist attitudes started to solidify on the part of the Eastern Bloc? And also, just a quick comment, since you mentioned about the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, how did that absurdity come about where I think was the Ukraine and Belarus were given their own delegates at the UN? That always intrigued me. Thanks.
I haven't followed that last question in detail. My impression was that that was the kind of thing that the Soviet Union was able to negotiate because of its the outsized role that the Red Army played in defeating Nazi Germany. Maybe Nikita Khrushchev had something to do with that. He was the active during the war in Ukraine, but you'd have to ask a historian of the Soviet Union and of Ukraine as to how Ukraine wound up having a seat as well. Now that I think about the question, it's a very important question because it's the kind of question that Vladimir Putin, of course, would not like to hear, because in 1945-6, and the United Nations was being established, there was such a thing as Ukrainian SSR that had a separate seat at the United Nations. In other words, one way of looking at it is that this was just Soviet cleverness. They got 2 votes instead of 1. Isn't that sneaky? Another way of looking at it is that somebody, at least in those years, viewed Ukraine as a separate state, with justifying to have its own seat at the United Nations. The antagonism to Israel in global politics took place in 2 phases. The first phase began in 1949 with the anti-cosmopolitan purges in the Soviet bloc, the murders of the Soviet Anti-Fascist Committee, and then the Slansky trial, and all of that. And then the Soviet decision to shift to seeking support from the Arabs and to present Zionism as a product of American imperialism. So that's 1949 to 1960, 5, whatever. Communist China was the first state to have an embassy of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1965, but Communist China didn't have weapons and didn't have much of anything that anybody else wanted, other than little red books. But you're right that 1967 is a turning point in terms of the spread of Soviet bloc and Arab and Palestinian anti-Zionism into the global new left. And so, and then the campaigns at the United Nations that were so incredibly successful by the Soviet Union and the PLO that reversed the realities. One maybe a good way to close it. When I was working on this book, I came across a speech. When I was working on Undeclared Wars with Israel, I came across a speech by the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations during the debates about Palestine, Israel, Zionism, racism, and all that. And he said, I forget his name, he said, the realities in world politics of 1974 are not those of 1947. So he obviously remembered what had gone on in 1947 and understood that things were very, very different. It was perhaps an incautious remark on his part to acknowledge how different things were. But yeah, I think that's yeah, that's what I would say. What I would say about that. The anti-Zionism of the global left in recent years rests on many conceptual or political assertions, but one of the things that it rests on, and maybe this is a good way of closing, is and that's what I can do as a historian. That's my particular contribution. That this anti-Zionism, which at times merges into anti-Semitism, rests on a set of falsehoods about the political realities of Israel's establishment in international politics. And so I want to set the record straight with this book.
Thank you. It was an absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you. Just fascinating. And I'm sure many of us are going to want to go straight out and buy your book. It sounds just wonderful.
Well, I hope so, but writing serious books in this age of Facebook and Twitter and the short attention span is countercultural, but sometimes there's just no substitute for sitting alone and reading a book. I mean, this audience obviously knows that. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.